everyone, and welcome to another Scots Way Hey podcast. Today, I'm joined by TV comedy writer and author Lee Stuart Evans to talk about his novel Pleasantly Disturbed, which is out now. Hello, Lee.
Hi, Alistair. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. So, first of all, can you give us a synopsis of Pleasantly Disturbed?
Yes, Pleasantly Disturbed is a novel about musical obsession, as well as being a story of young love, and it has an additional crime twist in there as well.
That's an absolute elevator pitch. I can tell you've done this before. So we'll touch on all of those elements, but I'm interested in why you wanted to write it. What was it that kind of gave you the push to write this novel in particular?
This particular one is my second one. I did my first one about 7 years ago, and to be honest, I didn't imagine that I'd ever write another one. I really didn't think I had any other ideas. And this one, Pleasantly Disturbed, came about in the sort of April of 2020, when the COVID lockdown suddenly appeared.
Yeah.
And being a freelance comedy writer, a lot of my work is in television studios, obviously in huge rooms with lots of people. And at the end of March, when the lockdowns occurred, suddenly my freelance diary, which had one or two biggest shows coming up throughout the summer of 2020, suddenly all the little dates that had work, job, day, here, there, all suddenly got rubbed out. The rubber came out and all the days disappeared. And suddenly I'd gone from a very busy summer diary to an empty one practically. And a few of the little jobs came along to fill it up when they made some very quick television shows, which were mainly doing voiceovers for clip shows, that kind of thing. I had a huge amount of space and time, and I sat at home, two young boys at home as well, who were 9 and 13 at the time. And my habit used to be, when I first started, I've been writing full-time 22 years, and then 4 or 5 years before that, where I did it in my spare time as well as working in TV production. Well, the habit was, as being freelance, if I ever got any time or an empty diary, I used to practice just writing jokes. I would just buy 4 or 5 daily newspapers and just write anyway. There's only so many years you can keep doing that, you know. So after 20 odd years, I needed something else to do. And I liked the idea. I'd liked the idea for a long time of writing another book. I never really quite had a solid idea. And then quite genuinely, during lockdown, my eldest son was just having to decide what to do for his GCSEs. And was really unsure which subjects to pick, you know, and feeling quite stressed about the whole situation, as you do at that age. And I said, I went through the very same thing, but the important thing is to just try and do something that you enjoy, which sounds like good advice. But again, I wasn't in that, I didn't follow any kind of advice like that myself at that age. And he just said, well, what did you do what did you want to do when you were 15 or 16? And quite honestly, I said, I wanted to be a train driver, until I found out I was colorblind. And then I was a bit stumped, because the only other thing I wanted to do was be Jim Kerr from Simple Minds. Which I think is like a thought that I never actually said aloud before, even though it was obviously in there. I don't think I'd ever told anyone in quite so, you know, so boldly that was what the situation was. And I think that thought stayed in my head for quite a while during lockdown. And I just kept trying to write bits and bobs. Then I'd write sketches. And obviously these days, because you've got mobile phones and on WhatsApp group, a lot of the other comedy writers that I knew, we'd randomly send jokes to each other every day, you know, and I'd be doing that. And I just had this idea of, I thought it's a funny premise, the idea of saying, I want to be Jim Kerr. I don't want to be like him. I want to be him. And I'm a big believer whenever I write anything, even if it's a joke or if it's a whole comedy routine or whatever, or a book, you should always lie to yourself about the size of the project. So, you know, never say you're going to write a book. Never say you're going to write a 1 hour stand-up show or a sketch series or anything like that. So I lied to myself and thought that would make quite a nice little 1 or 2 page sketch. So I started writing this idea of a teenage boy being 15, 16, being sent to his school careers advisor to ask him what he wants to do when he leaves school, or rather tell him what he should be doing or what his limited options are. So that's how the book started, and that's how it still begins. I tried to write a sketch, and I did that. As I say, I lied to myself, and then I just said, I might try and write the next bit. In theory, what would happen after that if it was a book? I didn't build up any expectation. I just thought, it's lockdown. No one's doing anything. They'll probably never get published. Let's just try and have a bit of fun with it. And I kept going with it, doing a little bit every day, writing small 500 words a day, to start with. And then as time went on, my wife was able to work from home quite easily. She doesn't matter where she is for her job. So she had pretty much a normal existence apart from the rest of us being in the house. And as time went on, she said, she kept saying, "What are you doing up there all the time? You're very quiet." So once it got to about 15 or 20,000 words, more or less a quarter of the first draft, I eventually told her. So it then went from lying to myself. She started to have these expectations. She asked if she could read what I'd done so far. And she said, "Oh, I really like this. You must keep going with it." So suddenly from this idea that was just a little bit of a joke and then sort of kidding myself, I suddenly had this pressure of this one person audience. Every couple of days, she kept saying, "You haven't given me anything to read." And I thought, "Oh, okay." And she started demanding it. So it was like, in the old days, on Charles Dickens and Trollope and stuff, and they'd write those enormous books, but they were newspaper serials, weren't they? That went on for 18 months. It turned into that where I had an audience demanding to see the next chapter. So I had to finish it. So that's how it came about. So there's a part of it. And again, it's very uplifting. My previous book has got it's not a dark book, but it was more in keeping. It was a nod to a lot of those old 1950s and 60s, big kitchen sink films, but the novels at that time, like Alan Sillitoe and Stan Barstow and John Brain and so on. Whereas this one, I think partly because I think I wanted to write a funny book, but also the whole COVID lockdown. It was a really scary time, wasn't it, for everyone, from the point of you genuinely didn't know what was going to happen from one week to the next. So I started reading lots of P.G. Wodehouse and watching Audrey Hepburn films, just insisting that everything had to be joyful. And an extra bonus of that, once I had this idea that I was going to try and write the story about this boy who wants to be Jim Kerr, I got not only my records, I've still got all my records I've bought since I was 10. So I've got all my Simple Minds records from the mid-'80s when I started getting into them. I dug all those out, as well as all my old tour programs. And I have most of the T-shirts I bought since I was 15. I think there are two that I've got photographic evidence that I no longer have. But I've got some that are faded and some that are about that long, come down halfway down my chest. So I got out the whole thing and immersed myself in it. So, yeah. So that became part of the avoid the misery of COVID, just to cheer myself up. And Simple Minds became a really big part of that. So I'd go, before I started work, I'd have a shower in the morning, then get dressed. And while I was thinking about what I was going to write, I'd just put another Simple Minds record on, turn it up really loud, just trying to get in the vibe. It really helped. It's escaped from the outside world. So it was as much as a therapy and self-preservation exercise as any sort of commercial or artistic endeavor.
And I suppose it's a great to escape into, in this case, someone else's formative years, but I guess you have to mine your own to do that. As you say, going back and listening to the albums and even digging out the old T-shirts and all that kind of thing. It's actually, I guess, a really good way to escape what was going on in the present day at that time.
Yeah, oh, completely. It was a fantastic escape. But I was thinking, when you're trying to explain it, and people say, middle-aged people always tend to write books about where they're looking back and trying to remember their lost youth and stuff. But rather than looking back for something that you lost, it sounds odd. I felt by going back to being that sort of age, being 15, 16 in the late 80s, I took it from there as looking forward. So being a positive book. So going back to that sense, that innocence, it's like a mixture of terror and excitement and confidence, isn't it? They're all there together. You've got no idea what's going to go on. This huge world or huge space of a future hangs in front of you, but you're also terrified as well because you've got no idea what you're going to do. That was really nice. I kind of went, yeah, don't look back like some old guy writing, wistful story of his lost youth. I just go back to 17, 15, 16, 17 and look forward and try and remember how exciting and confusing it was. So yeah, a complete escape from the real world for best part of over a year. I wrote the first draft really quickly, in about 4 months, because we managed to escape on holiday in August. There's a little window, wasn't there?
Yeah.
From about the end of July to the beginning of September, we managed to escape for a week, and I finished it before that, and then came back and started basically the first rewrite for about another 8 months till the following summer. But yeah, so no, it was a fantastic escape.
And that opening scene, it's really interesting to hear you say that's where it actually began, because it really does set the tone for exactly what you said there. You've got this guy at his, and I can remember going without an idea about what I wanted to do to a careers officer, and having to come up with something. I think I may have said truck driver at one point,
Yeah.
But to have the confidence to say I want to be Jim Kerr is fantastic. And it just sets this character of Robin up so well. And throughout, there's this lovely mix of having a confidence. There's a scene where he dresses up as Jim Kerr and his mum and sister catch him, which is just brilliant. And but also being aware of the effect that might have on contemporaries in and around school, the guys who maybe don't share his flamboyance and musical tastes.
Yes, I wasn't half as a lot of it's wishful thinking. It's interesting. I've had quite a few people get in touch. Some of them I genuinely haven't seen since I was at school, who said they bought it, knowing about it through friends of friends or from social media. And there have been one or two people going through it saying, and I know who that person is. I know who that person is. And I have to keep saying genuinely, there's no one real in it at all, And they go, well, that's obviously you. But I was no way. I wasn't that sort of focused, that singular, at that age. I was obsessed with Simple Minds. They were my number one. But at that age, you're learning, you're listening to lots of other stuff. I flirted with lots of other bands, I had lots of other records, but Simple Minds were the first ones that just really took hold, when it's your band and you just wanted to know everything about them. And there's in that way that I just think people do it quite as much now. I think, you read every piece of small print on the back of an album cover, and you'd buy any magazine that had the vaguest little snippet of a review or saying something was released this week, because there's no internet, of course. And we never had a video recorder until about 1989, I don't think. You couldn't even tape stuff off Top of the Pops and keep watching it. So you'd have to hope that your band were on Top of the Pops that week, or they're on the chart show or whatever it was. So
that's interesting how that's changed, because I think now there's so much information out there that if you love a band in the way that you're describing, then you could search, but one, you'd be a kind of endless search and often finding the same quotes, but just in different places. Whereas when there was maybe 3 weekly music newspapers, the monthlies were just about maybe start to come in, if my memory serves me correct, the 80s. You knew the places that you would find these, and maybe in the newspapers with a band as big as Simple Minds, but you knew the places that you would find the snippets and all of these things.
Yeah, I used to snap anything up. There were quite a lot of record shops at that time. Mansfield was the nearest town in Nottinghamshire to where we lived, which is 5 miles away. Nottingham was just over 20, so 22, 23 miles away, which had lots of shops. It's a very cool place, Nottingham. So you take a 2-hour bus ride, two bus changes to get there, just in the hope you'd find the record you'd never heard of. Because again, you couldn't really find that comprehensive discographies at all. They turn up in the back of the odd books. I think at that time there was there's only one biography that had been written at that time, which is called Glittering Prize. I think came out about 85. I've got that somewhere. So your sort of knowledge, you were sort of mining yourself, really, weren't you? You kind of came across, you happened and fell on stuff, really. And a lot of information you used to find, even when they started reissuing albums, when they'd list previous records inside. So by the time I got into Simple Minds, they were huge. They were already, I think realistically, they probably were the biggest band in the world before U2's Joshua Tree came out in 87. And I kind of really got into them when Once Upon a Time came out. So that was end of 85, and I would have bought it early towards mid 86. But from that, obviously that's the sort of peak, what you would think of stadium Simple Minds, and their songs are, they're big and rousing, and for want of a better word, they've got like what look like proper song lyrics in them. They sort of make sense. So from there, I worked backwards, and obviously every album that I went backwards, the music becomes stranger and stranger, and more arty and more avant-garde, and sort of cryptic and mysterious. And I liked it even more the further I went back. But again, it was all discovery, like whereas now you'd play Alive and Kicking, wouldn't you? Then it'd suggest some other songs. And in 10 minutes, you'd be back into Reel to Reel and Life in a Day. Going, what's this? But it took me a long time to get through all the back catalogue, So, but I think that's what's exciting about it, isn't it? That's where your bond with the band came from.
more than perhaps any other band I can think of, that's a really interesting way to kind of discover the whole back catalogue of Simple Minds, going from the kind of peak stadium thing and then returning to the really early European influence, can influence things. I don't think, for instance, if you took U2, it's quite the same journey that way. It might be going the other way, but not, you know, that it's
Yeah,
yeah,
it is. It's almost the reverse, isn't it, of U2
yeah.
in a way? It is, yeah, yeah. Especially when you get towards Actung Baby, and then was the one after that, Zeropa and stuff like that. It becomes very different to where you are in 1980 on War and Boy and so on. Yeah, yeah, that
So
was really exciting.
why was it Jim Cairn Simple Minds? Well, one, why was it your obsession? And, you know, I guess that's the reason it's Robin's obsession.
I suppose I started buying records really early on. The first thing that I got obsessed with was the two-tone scene. I've got a ridiculous picture of me when I'm 11 wearing a Harrington covered in two-tone badges, the Specials and the Beat and the Madness badges. I bought a second-hand copy of Too Much Too Young. It must have been early '81 because I got into them before Ghost Town came out, because I bought that the week it came out. So I was already aware of them, because one of my best friends at school was really into Madness and the Specials. So I'd always been into music from that point, and always bought little bits of, old singles now and then. And I went sort of from that into, kind of what I suppose what was sort of futurist, and went into new romantic type stuff. So, from like early Depeche Mode and Japan, and then later into, moving to Echo and the Bunnymen and the Cure and Lloyd Cole. All those things they were all things, that sort of area that I liked. And a lot of the coolest people at school when you were 12 or 13, which sounds an odd thing to say now, but the girls who had the Phil Oakey haircut from Human League, and the guys who were sort of vaguely heading towards gothy haircuts and stuff, they all seemed the coolest people. So I liked all those things, and used to go to under 18s discos, from being about 13. There were quite a few in our village and nearby. And the same crowd used to go all the time. There's a local band called B Movie who were from Mansfield, just up the road from us. The weird thing with them, again, back to the thing about not being able to do any research, they'd had these two, what we thought were huge hits called Remembrance Day and Nowhere Girl, and they were played every week without fail at all these discos. And it'd be in the middle of Rio by Duran Duran, and Quiet Life by Japan, and Tainted Love would be on by Soft Cell and Bedsitter and stuff, and then B Move would be on. So for a long time, I just thought, well, they're on that plane. It's from a couple of years ago when I was probably 9 or 10, but they were obviously huge as well. So I didn't know for years that their songs had got to like number 63 and 67, I think,
Yeah.
But yeah, no, through those discos, I must have been aware of things like Promise You a Miracle and stuff, because I knew them. But what really, I suppose, I mean, I came in at like the obvious point. It's probably I'm sure, Died in the Hall. Fans will go, oh, that's not very good. That's not a cool entry, but it would have been Don't You Forget About Me. I would have heard that at the under 18s disco in sort of '85, but I didn't buy it. I remember really liking it, and that was one of the end of the night songs that everyone would dance to, and they play Live and Kicking and Sanctified probably as well. So I bought Once Upon a Time without even reading the back of it, because that was a new album, thinking, Don't You Forget About Me is bound to be on it, isn't it?
Yeah.
I didn't even look. So I got on the bus on the way back and read the back of it and went, oh, it's not on. But anyway, I completely loved Once Upon a Time. So from there, as I was saying, I got that. I just absolutely played it to death, and then bought the singles off it. And I think all the things she said, it's got the live version of Don't You Forget About Me on it. So I ended up with that as well. But as I say, then I worked backwards, and I just liked them the more and more I went back. So, yeah.
Such an interesting time. And what you're talking about just makes me remember my time, where you move often in those kind of mid-teens and pre-teen years. You can move and change your musical tastes and all of those things so much. I started off probably due to the influence of older cousins kind of into heavy metal at the age of 8, 9, and which I still think is the age you should be into heavy metal. When you think of the imagery and all that stuff, it seems like a kind of world. But then, I used to discovering new romantic music, and then indie bands like the Smiths, who became such a huge thing in my life. And then, later on there was dance music. But it just seems that you're almost taking on everything. And we'll talk about Robin's relationship with his girlfriend Fliss later, because that has an influence on what he listens to, as it does with so many people at that age as well.
Yeah.
when I was reading the book, I have to mention this because when I was at secondary school in about second year, I sat beside a good friend of mine, Greg Swan, and if you're listening, Greg, hello, who after seeing Purple Rain came in dressed as Prince Purple Rain. Now it was Paisley Pattern pajamas and shirts and all that. And he was
fantastic.
the hair, and he was, and as much as he could grow up a moustache. And he did that for years.
That's fantastic.
And this was the third biggest comprehensive school in Scotland. This was not an easy place to pull that off.
That's a brave move, isn't it? That's a really brave move. And as I was saying earlier, I didn't have half the balls, for want of a better word, that Robin has. The idea, even that actual commitment, almost telling yourself that you want to dress up in those clothes. I would have definitely liked it when you're saying what was the thing that drew you over. A lot of the imagery on the records, as they working backwards, they didn't really appear on the covers properly, did they? Till Once Upon a Time, but those 81 albums, Sons of Fascination and Sister Feelings, when there's all this blurred Malcolm Garrett photographs on there, and the sort of there's a mysteriousness to it and all the worldliness, and then on the back cover of New Gold Dream, there is a photograph of them. They look like in a hothouse somewhere. It's just loads of plants. And Jim Kerr's definitely got eyeliner on, his hair shaved at the side, and doing, those kind of gestures and the moves he'd do. He'd sort of just put his hands in a certain position where it felt almost religious. It was like a mixture of a life model and some sort of religious gesture. It felt like there was more to it than some blokes just playing guitars and singing. You were saying about what drew me in. There was a mysteriousness and an otherworldliness that, in hindsight, when you look back, they were still really young, weren't they? By that time, when you're sort of 15, the guys who were 25 seemed very old. So they seemed old and very worldly. And I said, a lot of those early songs, when they talk about like Empires and Dances, a lot about traveling through Europe, just still at the end, towards the end of the Cold War and what it was like. And they were dropping in things about politics and stuff, which again, you don't think is any of your business really when you're 15. You go, why do these guys care about politics? Why should it matter what's happening in Eastern Europe? Like men marching and stuff like that. So it was all that stuff that drew me in. There was a sort of, apart from the music being fantastic, there was that strangeness where you wanted to identify with them so much. You would think, if this feels important to Jim Kerr and the rest of Simple Minds, it must be important. I should know about it. Because if being interested in this stuff has made them this bad, I'd really like to have a bit of that knowledge, or whatever it is, the secret that they seem to have latched onto. I'd quite like to have that, because you just felt very awkward, very out of place, in a mining village. You could see 3 coal mine, the pit tips and the still working wheels. You could see 3 from my bedroom window at school, literally. And if you went to the end of the street, you could see 2 more. We were surrounded by 5 of them. So it didn't seem at all glamorous. Everyone's dad, either worked at the pit, or if they were really successful, they might have had a shop or worked in a factory, which is sort of nice in a way. There was a community in those places, but it didn't feel glamorous, and it felt a long way from the pictures on the backs of album covers in NME of guys under spotlights, surrounded by dry ice, with Jim Curry's trousers tucked in his socks and wearing what looked like ballet slippers. And you mentioned your friend dressing up as Prince. You just look at that; it just felt like these people are literally the same. The way people talk about David Bowie in the 70s, these people just like they're from another planet.
Yeah.
How on earth do I get to be like that?
And the scene, we won't give anything away, but there is a scene where he gets caught, dressing as Jim Kerr quite brilliantly. And it's that thing about being proud of doing it, but embarrassed by it as well. And I think that mixture of pride, as you say, confidence, and almost constant cringe kind of almost defines the teenage years, or at least it did for me.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is, isn't it? It's like the idea of any form of ambition, particularly if you don't grow up in a household or in a family or even an area within a sort of peer group where anyone's had any vaguely artistic either experience or ambition. We didn't know anyone who'd ever been in a band, not as in a proper band. My old uncle, my mum's brother, he'd been in bands in the 60s, in the sense that he'd played around local working men's clubs in sort of, I guess, 60s, what you call kind of like what would be wedding bands now. They were doing like Animals and Searchers covers and that, that kind of stuff. But no one you would know would realistically say, when I leave school, I want to be a musician, or I want to be an artist or an actor. honestly, you would absolutely, as you talked about the comprehensive school dressing up as Prince, you would absolutely be drummed out of school if anyone would even said that. There was, towards being end of our school, we were what, 15 or 16. There was one girl who was, I mean, a very, very attractive girl who she'd had some photographs taken in a sort of catalogue model type way, I suppose you would say. Yeah, the old catalogues.
Yeah.
Really quite innocent, wearing nice coats for some catalogue, and word got round school, and it was it was like she was a witch. She'd had the audacity to stand there and pose. Like, who on earth did she think she was doing this? When you think how many pictures people take of themselves now, the
Yeah.
whole thing is pouting and sticking
Yeah.
your lips out. But she'd literally, I think, modeled something like an Aaron's jumper or
For
a
the
cardigan for like a knitting pattern or something like that. And word got around that she really basically thought she was Elizabeth Taylor. So the idea of, even
and
vaguely trying to,
you mentioned kind of two-tone and having the Harrington and maybe the pork pie hat, whatever. It seemed to me that that was, or up here, mods, skinheads, two-tone, that kind of thing. That was belonging. That was a gang. That was kind of, you could dress in that way.
yeah,
Actually, there's lots of people around you that dressed in that way as well. And
yes,
how many holes you had in your Doc Martens mattered and
yeah,
all that kind of stuff. But what you're
yeah,
talking about with Robin and Jim Kerr and that kind of, that's an individual statement. That's going, no,
yeah.
I see this individual guy that doesn't fit in any of those gangs. That's who I want to kind of aim to be like. And that's a brave thing to step outside that, I think.
Yeah, it was a real step further, wasn't it? Later on, probably what, 86, 87, towards the end of leaving,
Yeah.
what would have been the old fifth year at comprehensive school. I had a couple of friends in my year who were really good friends who probably went the whole hog by the time of sixth form in for the full goth look. I remember them doing that, and it was such a brave move. And but yeah, before that, no one really stepped out of line at all. But I always really admired them for doing that, and I quite liked a mixture. It was my hair was naturally kind of white, almost Boris Johnson white. So I would have made the worst goth. I would have liked to sort of Ian McCulloch, halfway between Ian McCulloch and Robert Smith type haircut would have been great. But yeah, I had the wrong hair, wrong colouring and everything for it. I would have been the worst goth.
Back
So
coat
yeah.
up to here, I can see it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, I had a couple of mates who look like they look fantastic, but yeah, I could never look the part. But yeah, even the idea of there is a bit in the book actually where I mentioned I said Jim Kerr had these, I don't know whether they were ballet slippers, but if you look around about 82 New Gold Dreamtime, he used to have kind of like beige trousers tucked in black socks, almost like army, almost combat trousers almost, but they looked like shiny ballet slippers. And at the time, there was about 85, 86, there was a vogue for some reason in sport shops. You could buy Kung Fu slippers that were really cheap. So I had some of those. I used to wear them in the middle of winter. So when it was snowing, they'd get wet within about 4 steps out of your front door. And then obviously, of course, they'd dry and stain with all lines on them. But I still wore them. That was about as far as they dare go for the Jim Kerr outfit. Certainly not the leggings.
Well, actually, you just reminded me, one of my first gigs when I was about 15, maybe 16, so roughly about the same age you're talking, was seeing Simple Minds headlining this fantastic, they did 2 days at Ibrox with a big, the Water Boys were there and Lloyd Cole
Yeah,
and this kind of thing. And
yeah, that
went
would be
along in a
86, wouldn't
pair
it?
of canvas espadrilles. So my
Oh,
feet were absolutely soaking by the end of the thing. It's ridiculous, but it was that right. It was the closest I think I could get to the ballet slipper
yeah,
that there was at the time.
yeah, yeah. I
Suffering for
think
the
I'm.
fashion.
I think I've got a school picture as well for again about 16ish, and trying to keep that look. When you were in the fifth year, you were allowed to wear any colour shirt and any colour tie you liked. That was the you could move away slightly from the standard uniform. And I bought some really horrible patent leather slip-on shoes, almost like Tudor shoes but without a buckle. But I thought they were obviously they resemble Jim Kerr shoes slightly. But I just remember everyone going, "What on earth are you wearing on your feet?" But I couldn't tell anyone that they were meant to be a sort of little nod, Jim Kerr shoes. But,
Those shoes
yeah,
were described to me once as snooker shoes because people in the snooker clubs of Glasgow would often have the patent slip-on shoe. That was
oh, yeah,
so. We mentioned Fliss and her relationship with Robin is kind of key to the whole book, because we should say
Yeah.
that it is a classic kind of coming of age novel. That's at the heart of everything, and everything that we've spoken about. But how did you come up with both of their characters? How did they develop from this one scene, as you described, with someone at their careers officer, to then suddenly developing Robin's character and then bringing in Fliss as well?
As I mentioned earlier, I think the sort of starting point was someone who was from my sort of background, similar sort of area where I grew up, same sort of time. But I say a lot of it's more of a wishful thinking story. You know, you kind of take a starting point of someone who was 15, 16 and obsessed with simple minds and has an idea of having absolutely no idea of what his future is going to be, presumes it's going to be bleak. You know, he's been led to believe it's bleak all the way. And from this, I guess, from the wishful thinking point of view, my real story was sort of similar in terms of being obsessed by simple minds, and I generally didn't know what I wanted to do for a living. I I was quite bright at school, sort of generally in the top sets. You know, we said 1 to 10. I was generally in the top 3 usually, particularly for English and maths. I always liked creative things, and I was really into watching comedy. But again, like we're talking about, no one ever became an artist or a musician or an actor or anything like that. And again, comedy I wouldn't have registered on my radar as being a job either. So rather than in the book, I wanted Robin to meet basically the sort of girlfriend I wish I could have met when I was that age, who would have had an instant sort of positive guiding effect on me, hopefully to achieve what I thought, if you asked the 16-year-old me, where I would have wanted to have gone in life, really. So that was kind of premise, and Fliss is the sort of perfect ideal, I suppose, of the girlfriend I think I would have needed or would have liked in an ideal world. And I suppose part of that thing I said about growing up and having those ideas and living in your head and wanting to be like your favorite rock star and constantly walking around with songs playing in you. I used to sort of, I suppose, like a lot of people do, pretend you're in a film, but in mine, I'd sort of imagine I was in a John Hughes film, you know, like Ferris Bueller or The
Yeah.
Breakfast Club, but in the mining village, I'd always kind of pretend I was in my own version, or like Gregory's Girl, you know, what would it be like if I was on it? A really good soundtrack and this had happened. So I tried to write that. Really. So it's a combination of wishful thinking and what would my John Hughes film be if it took place where I grew up. So that's really where that came from. I said, where's my own? I just kind of literally blundered from one thing to another. And like Robin, I did take a job in a garage just for the sake of it, because my friend had got a job there and said there was a vacancy. And I literally went there with no idea, other than that it was going to earn me £27.50 a week, which I could spend on records. So that was my starting point. And I suppose in the back of my mind, I suppose I held vague ideas of doing something connected with music. And I did start playing guitar and got in bands, but I never thought I was good enough. So then after that, I suppose I thought maybe I could hang on the tail of music in some way, but maybe get a job at a local radio station, or maybe possibly for a music magazine, or there must be these jobs that exist in the world of records and stuff like that. So mine was just very convoluted that ended up being a TV comedy writer, which there is a logic to them, you know. Just I went back to college, and when I started doing bits of journalism, they always ended up with bits of humour in them, and the lecturer kept saying, "Can you do anything without putting jokes in it?" And I thought, mate, and he said, "I'm not saying you shouldn't. It's really good. You should keep going with it." So everything that I did, whatever it was, whether it was making a video, doing a radio show, so I did one of the dreaded media studies courses, and yeah, humour kept going into all of those things, and that's where my own path went. But yeah, for Robin and Fliss, it was more of a wishful thinking thing. So with Fliss, who in the book is essentially a musical prodigy,
Yeah.
whereas Robin is he's raised by a single mom on a council estate from sort of the poorest part of a smallish town. Fliss is a musical prodigy who's has been playing piano since she's sort of 4 or 5 and can play several instruments. And by this time, in her early teens, she's starting to write songs and collections of notebooks with lyrics and things in them. But she doesn't have any confidence at all, or as well as not just confidence as a person, she doesn't have that need that a lot of people who seek the public eye do, where she doesn't need any approval, and she doesn't see why she should try and sell herself, if you like. She likes performing for the sake of it. So that's part of what the story is. Whereas on the one hand, Robin is absolutely full of confidence and cocky, and on the surface has everything it takes to be a frontman, has absolutely no talent at all. she's the reverse. I mean, she is a genius, but doesn't feel any need or desire to perform. So that's the key to their love story, I suppose. Is the romance, is how they fall in love, but also how each of their qualities and failings come together, and they sort of both help each other. So that's what I wanted to do with that. And I suppose you were trying to, he's meant to be the sort of, Robin is very much the idiot. You know, the title Pleasantly Disturbed, although it is first song that Jim Kerr and Charlie Burchill wrote for Sinful Minds, it does also sum up exactly what Robin's personality and his mindset at that age is, his mental situation. He is a bit messed up, but in a kind of nice way, really. He's got a couple of demons, you know, that there are hints and nods towards his earlier childhood, and, you know, and the way he refers to his ex-dad had treated his mum. So, yeah, I really wanted to show how, I guess, they're both obsessed with music in different ways, you know. Fliss is obsessed particularly with Prince and Kate Bush, but she has the talent and the understanding of where it comes from. So I wanted Robin to see that a lot of his bluster and confidence is really a shield for his terror, as we were saying earlier. That age is a mixture of confidence and excitement and sheer terror. He's got more terror than anything else that's covered up by an outward confidence, really. And the terror is he genuinely doesn't think he's going to achieve anything, because he's from a place where not many people do. And he's always been told that he'll never achieve anything. So a lot of it is a shield, and also by living in this world of music and focusing on researching everything and wanting to know everything about his favourite music, he's really a way of not facing up to the future, really. And where Fliss comes in and helps with that, I think he just, something clicks, though, where if you do knuckle down and work hard, you can actually get something out of this idea of music. You might not just have to be daydreaming in your bedroom. There is a possibility here that you can do something with it. Again, without giving away too many spoilers, he does later on try and become a musician himself. But we'll say that much. So, and yeah.
The thing about him is, though, he's well liked. People like him. You know, like Bliss's parents seem to like him. People he works with seem to like him. As a reader, you like him as well. Gregory's Girl is an interesting comparison, because I think there is a touch of Gregory in there. You could, from the outside, say this is kind of slightly idiotic behaviour at times, but there's a charm there, you know, as well. I think that works.
Yeah, I think like a lot of kids, or if you grow up from that background, as I did, my parents split when I was 8, you know, and I was the eldest of 3. We were 8, 7, and 2 when my dad left, and my mum never remarried. And it's a combination of, my dad did genuinely say to my mum that none of us would ever achieve anything without him. She divorced him after she caught him having an affair, rather than he didn't leave. My mum asked him to leave. So there was a sort of resentment there. So that rankled, and that cropped up quite a lot. And again, as you'll know, you're talking about comprehensive schools at that time, the attitudes in schools were really different, you know. And teachers, you know, by the time I got to 13, 14, I would be messing around, and I would do silly noises and impressions of things from the young ones, or Blackadder, Fry and Laurie voices, you know. I would be the person who'd make that strange owl noise at, you know, the class, and eventually get thrown out. But inevitably, whenever I got in trouble, the first thing they would always say is, "What do you expect? There's no father at home."
Wow.
So yeah, so a lot of the thing you're saying about what you saying Robin is like, I wanted to put that in, because you do end up getting to that age of almost trying not to get a job, I suppose, when you're 15, 16. Because so I did pretty well at school, and I did all right. I had, you know, plenty of friends and stuff like that. But I did leave feeling sort of genuinely worthless. And I really thought, if I bounce into a job, I'm going to go from feeling worthless in one place to another. And what I wanted to put across is when Robin ends up in this garage, which he has no interest in liking at all. But at the same time, he just sort of cracks on and does it, and sort of surprises himself, really, that he's not completely useless, where he feels like his entire life has been being told he's absolutely useless. And he just expects that once school ends, it can only get worse, really. You know, you're an adult, you've got to find your own way. So yeah, I wanted that to come out, that he's almost surprised by people like him. So yeah, so that kind of was deliberate. It's a shock to him, really, that he's taken under the wing of particularly older men as well. You know, a lot of the older guys in the garage, you sort of befriend him. Yeah, so that was kind of based. That was partly based on truth, of having suddenly being surrounded. Again, I suppose you can maybe partly that's where music come from as well. You know, being brought up by mum, not really having any very close male role models really. But my uncle was great. It was my mum's. And then he had a little window from being about 11 to I was about 14, where he used to take me train spotting all the time. But he'd been recently divorced himself. So there was a little window where he was at a loose end in his mid-30s, which was perfect. So I got a lot of encouragement and learned a lot from him. I think by the time I was 16, 17, I was back on my own again and panicking. So I wanted to put that in really.
I think that's such a relatable experience that people, kids who are told, or at least made to feel that they were worthless at school, actually in their first job, often they are given responsibility and, you know, realize that they're not useless because the other people are making them feel they belong. I think that is quite a common experience.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's I don't know where that thing goes. You know, the moment I started, I said it was literally only working in a really small garage, but the fact you had a bit of responsibility, I really liked. You know, I suppose my mum, I think, automatically imagined that I'd be messing around at work as I would at school, and that didn't happen. And even now, you know, yeah, well past 50 now, and quite often working with comedians and TV comedy writers. Quite a few people, because obviously you don't get much louder than a lot of stand-up comedians. Quite often when I've said I used to be terrible at school, I was doing all sorts of things, you know, writing things on blackboards and doing impressions of school and getting, you know, banned from sport and all sorts of stuff. Nearly all the comedians I work for go, I can't see that at all. I can't see you doing that at all. You know,
Yeah.
I seem to thrive once I left school, you know, and again, I went back to, I went back to college when I was 24
Mm-hmm.
and started again, basically. And I was the biggest swat they'd ever seen when I went back to college. I did a BTEC to start with, and then when I went back to university in Salford in Manchester.
Mm-hmm.
And the moment I got homework set, I'd be doing it in the library that afternoon rather than going home. I absolutely loved it, and then suddenly I thought, okay, so I did like learning. You know, it suddenly all made sense. I just didn't want to be, I don't know, mixture of not wanting to be there. I suppose no, you sort of want to grow up and you don't want to grow up. So yeah, it was quite odd. It was just I couldn't wait to leave school. But it wasn't the learning. I really liked learning, but again, I suppose that's where music came in. Really, music ended up being my sort of surrogate teachers, really. But
Yeah.
I've joked a few times if I wrote a book once, I said I could write if I ever had an autobiography, it'd be called Morrissey was my English teacher, which is a good title. But Morrissey, it would be less Morrissey, really. You know, a lot of my literary encouragement. A lot of it came during Lloyd Cole saying, read Norman Mailer and get a new Taylor.
Yeah,
He
me too.
mentioned Simone de Beauvoir and Truman Capote. And again, I was saying about Simple Minds and talking about politics and Eastern Europe. But again, in interviews, a lot of pop stars that always name drop writers and other music. And for me, that's where my education comes from. Even Simple Minds, Jim Kerr was always talking about, again, that thing where you think the generation before you, all their music's irrelevant. Jim Kerr was always talking about the Velvet Underground and Patti Smith and stuff, where in mid-80s, I was thinking that has nothing to do with me at all. So that sent me back to those things. Then you see televisions, Marquee Moon and stuff like that, then your kind of world starts spreading. So as well as music, yeah, kind of, yeah, music was kind of like my gateway into genuinely into having an education, really.
That's
Yeah.
my experience as well, almost exactly the same. And whether it was films or whether it was books or whether other bands, it was in the interviews that you read about
Yeah.
from your favorite bands that you think, oh, go and check that out. It was absolutely the kind of education of pop culture. And I think what the book makes clear is at that point in your formative years, it can take on tremendous importance.
Yeah.
Absolutely shapes you at that time and probably shapes you beyond, probably shaped you beyond, from what you're saying.
Yeah. It's still happening, I think. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So
Yeah. That's
were you, the way that Robin's obsessed with Jim Kerr and you were yourself, were you obsessed with comedians similarly? Was comedy a big part of that life, or did that come later on? Or did it ever come? Did you just kind of write and found you were good at it?
No, as I was saying, in the sense that I didn't know anyone who ever had a job in any of those in music or anything else like that. I was always messing about. In hindsight, it's interesting hindsight, isn't it? Because a lot of people, again, I was saying people I know from school said, well, it's obviously obvious you were going to work in comedy. You're always messing around at school. It would never have crossed my mind, and it didn't at all. Not until I got back to college when I was 24. Um, I worked in 4 or 5 garages. Yeah, between being sort of 16 and 24, and yeah, music was my main thing really. And I read bits of fiction when I was at school, but mainly I read biographies, mainly music biographies, and odd history books now and then. It wasn't until much later on, early 20s. So I was aware you mentioned the Smiths earlier. I really got into Smiths, and obviously they had a lot of people on their single sleeves from the kitchen sink films. Sheila Delaney, was the playwright, was on, and Rita Tushingham's on there. And again, reading the interviews of that, I thought, why is this of interest? And at that same time, when I would have been 14, 15, they showed, I can't remember which channel it was must have been BBC or Channel 4. They showed all those films on weekday night.
That's right.
It must have been about 85-ish. And my mum let me stay up and watch them. And it was everything from Taste of Honey, and Alfie was on, and Loneliness, the Long Distance Runner. My mum said, Alan Sillitoe, who wrote the book of this, he's from Nottingham. And that really registered. And I looked in the school library, and they had one of those Longman books, double volumes. It's got Billy Liar in it and Loneliness, the Long Distance Runner, by 2 different authors. And I borrowed it from school, and I've still got it. so I never took it back. So that was my first adult book that I ever read. So no, it was a growing awareness of things. But of all the things, I was definitely I liked comedy, and I obviously picked up on stuff, and I was fascinated by the language of it, particularly again, TV now these days is obsessed about making programs that cater to people from their either social class or their background or wherever they're from. I remember a few years ago, someone asked me and a colleague if we'd be interested in working on writing a sketch show for working class people. And we just said, you just write a sketch show. It's got nothing to do with the class. And they went, oh, we thought you'd have different opinions of that. My friend's son of a Glasgow fireman. And we said, yeah, but when we were growing up, we loved Fry and Laurie, we loved Blackadder, we liked Pete and Dud, we liked Monty Python. They're all public school boys. That didn't matter. They were just funny. What we liked was funny.
Yeah.
So I was obviously aware, I had all those things in, but it had never clicked. I suppose it was like just something that I liked, I suppose. So by the time I got to college, as I say, my ideas when I started doing a media course, I thought maybe I could try and be a music journalist, try and do that, try and write a few reviews, maybe get a job in a record plugging company on a radio station or something like that. Just anything to be a bit nearer to music was the only idea I went in with. And a couple of lads who were on the course, they were younger than me, but they were already more focused on what they wanted to do. They wanted to be local radio DJs, and they had their own shows on like hospital radio or the local community station. So that how I got into comedy was I got on really well with them. They just said, you come and sit in and pick some records. So we just go and sit in and choose what we were going to play at like 11:30, inevitably, usually at a local station, 11:30 at night. Probably no one listening. And the lads used to buy the newspapers and write a couple of jokes, sort of aping people like Steve Wright, I guess, and Chris Evans at that time. And I just sort of picked up on going through newspapers and going, oh, let's do a little bit of business. It went from there, really. And then I'll say all the stuff whether I wrote it as a piece of journalism or whether it was like a radio piece, there'd always be humor in it. Mm-hmm. So I started writing jokes in my spare time, sending them into Radio 4 and Radio 2 to shows like News Headlines and Weekending and stuff.
Yeah.
So even when I was at college, I started to get a few bits on, and then I moved to London and got a job as a runner, T-boy basically, on that Doherty show. You probably remember. Yeah. On Channel 5, which was actually the first show on Channel 5. It started in I think, May 97. Mm. I was a runner from Feb 98 on that. And again, I bounced from then. I had 4 years of production as a sort of researcher and eventually a producer, but working more or less always on chat shows, including Jeremy Clarkson's, Frank Skinner's and Patrick Keelty's. So I'd just keep handing jokes in for their monologues that they did at the beginning of the show. So it kind of evolved from there. So I think it was always in there, but it would never have crossed my mind to do it as a job. So,
I guess as you said, if you don't know it's a job, then you can't even think that you might be the person to kind of go and do that. And we should mention, actually, you mentioned working in garages, and we did say at the beginning, there is another strand to the novel, which involves stolen cars and other dark goings on. And was that there from the beginning, or when did you decide that there was going to be this almost thriller aspect to it?
Yeah, it was there from the beginning, really. Even the very first draft, which was it was probably slightly longer-winded and had a lot of inconsequential bits that got pruned out. But yeah, it was essentially there um, because I knew I wanted. I think it's not a spoiler because it mentions it on the back. The idea is that both Fliss and Robin get drawn into this ring of car thieves for different reasons. They both end up with different connections to it, both unawares to each other. And this potential car crime results in someone getting killed, and this may or may not split Robin and Fliss's relationship. So I think, yeah, because I knew it, because it started in a garage, I wanted to think what's the worst thing that could come between them. And I had this note, this vague note when I was writing it, which I didn't do anything, but I didn't do anything with it or make a big deal of it. But I had this little note that I kept thinking about. It was one of the subtitles for the book could be "Why Rock Stars Make Better Role Models Than Crap Dads." and so I wanted an element of sort of suggesting, even if you like, from very poor background or on the surface a background that she's very successful. So in the book, Robin's parents are they're like the local business people in town. You know, they're members of, whether it be the Rotary Club or the Lions or whatever those local trade societies are. They're very much pillars of the community. And I sort of wanted to suggest that you can have dodgy parents of different kinds, whatever your background, you know. And on the surface, someone who looks like they have everything might be lacking somewhere else. And I thought that was quite an interesting way that perhaps something that goes on involving their parents might be an interesting crime. And obviously, Robin working in the garage, it quite naturally happened. I thought they should get roped into car crime. It naturally evolved as I wrote the story.
And
it's a bit like what? Sorry.
No, on you go.
I was saying it's a bit like, again, back to trying to live in my own John Hughes film. I did think what would happen. I sort of wanted a mystery element. I did like the idea of that. It's much more Scooby-Doo and Famous Five, isn't it, rather than Agatha Christie, the crime element. It's a comic crime element, even though someone gets killed in it. I wanted it to be fun because I did like those things at that time. But yeah, as it played, I just thought, what would be basically what were the businesses that were around at that time when I was growing up? If someone would have been a criminal, if there was a criminal gang, it wouldn't be huge drugs gangs and people trafficking happening in the mid-80s in Nottinghamshire on the edge of Sherwood Forest. And genuinely, at that time, it was peak car crime period. It was on the news all the time where hot hatchbacks, as they were called, were being stolen all the time. And I do remember that happening. And garages used to make a fortune selling burglar alarms and all sorts of stuff. So I thought it was a detail that I remembered. I thought that is it's convincing and it is legitimate. It does fit for the time, so it was perfect.
And you mentioned John Hughes and you spoke about Gregory's Girl. Were there other kind of coming of age influences, texts or things that, you know, fed into the book? Or
no, so I didn't read massively in terms of fiction at that time. The only sort of fictional stuff I would have read, like I say, apart from getting into the kitchen sink stuff, that was my first love, really. So I was sent back to all those films from being 14, 15, 16. When I went back to college, some of the projects I did projects about the kitchen sink movement, you know, and I did profiles of Ken Loach and Michael Caine. So my sort of, if you like, my teen heroes, really, a lot of them were kind of my parents' generation. So I had a lot of those. So I read a lot of those books from that time, all those, as a Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, and Billy Liar. Billy Liar was a really big deal growing up. There's a bit of Billy Liar, I think, in Pleasantly Disturbed. He's a Midlands 80s Billy Liar, I think. It's rock and roll rather than the vague idea. Of course, Billy Liar, he wants to run away to London to be a comedy writer, which that took on an extra resonance many years later. So maybe that did sink in. Again, another element that I didn't know about.
Well, Lee, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really enjoyed Pleasantly Disturbed. I didn't know what to expect, but whatever my expectations were, it surpassed them, and I'm sure other people will as well.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm really pleased you enjoyed it. But thanks for inviting me onto your podcast as well. It's really kind. Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure.